With that, let's bring in our journalist panel tonight, once again joined by Joanna Smith, the Ottawa bureau chief for the Canadian Press, and Christopher Nardi, parliamentary reporter for the National Post, who is covering the inquiry. Good to see both of you again.
You too, Michael.
Hi, Michael.
Joanna, I'll get you to start us off because, you know, as the Deputy Prime Minister was giving her testimony today, she said the convoy was a personal threat for many Canadians because it threatened their economic security, which seems to be another layer of how the government is defining a threat to this country. What did you make of Chrystia Freeland's economic argument?
It was interesting. She really raised some of the points that her deputy minister raised last week, which of course makes sense. They would be aligned on this. But she was testifying that the protests, really risked exponentially escalating an economic uncertainty that Canada was in at the time. It coincided with a period of fragility, she said, for the Canadian economy, where there were major supply chain disruption issues. There were protectionist American plans at the time to bring in a tax incentive for American-made electric vehicles. And I know the Canadian cabinet, many levels of government in Canada, were putting on a full court press to do everything they could to convince the U.S. government and Congress to not go that way. I know they tried everything. They were saying you have to view this as North America made. The future of the electric car industry and all the sort of critical mineral and battery and everything related is a big part of Canada's sort of long-term plans for transition economy, part of their net zero plans. So the U.S. messing that up was a really big deal, and they really needed to have goodwill and good faith and good relations with the U.S. Coming at a time where coming after 4 years of Donald Trump, where that relationship was really strained. Freeland had played a really big role in that relationship with the Trump government, and also this was also happening at a time when it was pretty clear that Russia was set on invading Ukraine, and as we all know, Freeland has also played a big role in Canada's response to that war. So these things were sort of top of mind. I think you can understand how it would be top of mind for her. This is her portfolio. And she said, finding out the White House was very, very worried about this was what she called a dangerous moment for her.
And really, her argument was bolstered by messages that she was receiving from the banking industry, investors, even from a senior economic advisor to the U.S. president. Chris, talk to us about what was shared on those fronts with the commission today.
Probably the most interesting part that we've seen today, quite frankly, Michael. And so it'll start with this one call she had on February 10th. So that's about 4 days before the Emergencies Act was invoked. She sets up a call with one of Biden's top economic advisors. His name is Brian Dees. And on that call, Brian Dees makes it abundantly clear that he's now realizing how interconnected the Canada and U.S. economies' supply chains are, especially. And he is not saying that in a good way. He is saying that in listen, we have been, flirting, as you know, with some very protectionist measures. The government had been receiving pressure from both Democrat and Republican lawmakers to increase protectionism in the United States. And now suddenly a crucial trading partner, Canada, is showing that they can't keep the border open and this supply chain is too interconnected to our possible liking. That's the U.S.'s perspective. And so Freeland said she left that call very worried, very, very worried, because this could be a new excuse that any U.S. lawmaker could use to basically bolster protectionism in the United States. And a few days later, she has that call that you just referred to with, the CEOs of the 6 large banks in Canada, and they basically reiterate the same thing, that Canada has a huge risk for its reputation through these, particularly the border blockades, and also they're really worried that they can't act under current legislation fast enough against convoy organizers' funding in order to, essentially cut them off from their liveliness. So she's getting a lot of pressure both from Canadian industry and from the U.S. to put an end particularly to the border blockades so that they don't lose crucial trade elements to the United States, to basically the United States bringing in protectionist measures and cutting Canada out of the equation, particularly in the automobile industry.
Now, the Deputy Prime Minister, she was taken on for condemning authoritarian regimes, but at the same time justifying an act that limited protest in this country. And again, she went back to an economic argument. Let's take a listen to that part of today's testimony.
Surely you agree that in Canada, which is a democracy, the right to protest, the right to demonstration must be sedulously protected, and that economic security does not trump those rights.
What was undermining of Canada's economic security sufficiently dangerously that I believe we needed to act, and it was the right thing to do, was that our trade was being stopped and was being seriously blocked. And I was very worried that that was handing arguments to U.S. protectionists who were already on the move, and that had that relationship been seriously damaged, that would really hurt Canada.
Now, of course, that goes to what both of you have been talking about here, this economic argument. But I guess, Joanna, the challenge here really for the government is that the CPAC Act does not mention economic security as a grounds for national emergencies.
It doesn't. That definition includes espionage, sabotage of Canada's interests, foreign influence, act of serious violence against people or property with political, religious, ideological objectives, the violent overthrow of the Canadian government. Listen, she's making a political argument, but she's not really making a legal one. And she was kind of asked about that. And she was also asked whether the Liberal government's decision to use the Emergencies Act was correct. Like she said that it was correct, but she refused to detail whether the economic harm that she was talking about actually formed the basis of the government's decision. She kept saying, I'm not a lawyer. She relies on the judgment of officials who advise the government on the expert legal advice. But as we know, as we discussed yesterday, especially in the context of David Lametti's appearance and his claiming of solicitor-client privilege, that analysis is missing from public view, at least for now. It's a missing piece of the puzzle. We don't actually know what the analysis by the Department of Justice was. We know that the government, based on the opinion and what we heard from the clerk of the Privy Council and the National Security Advisor, thought that maybe the CPAC definition was too narrow. And everyone's pointing to this legal analysis that the Commission has not seen. So again, two things we don't know is how strongly the economic harm Freeland talked about was actually part of the decision, and what the actual legal analysis that everyone says the decision was really based on actually said.
In fact, coming up right after this, we're going to speak with that lawyer that you saw in that clip, because she's with the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. We're going to talk a bit about the solicitor-client privilege and the impact that has on this commission. But really, what this all sets up, the Deputy Prime Minister, and we should note after her, members of the PMO staff, this all sets up tomorrow's final day of testimony, and that will be the Prime Minister. So, Joanna, what will you be listening for as Justin Trudeau takes the stand?
He ultimately bears responsibility for the decision to invoke the Emergencies Act. He, I think, would be Canada's leading expert on why that decision was made, having really been the final one to make it. So I'd like to hear, I'm looking forward to hearing as clear an articulation as we can from the man himself why that decision was made. I'm also just peripherally interested in whether he's going to be introspective, as he sometimes is, perhaps not in this highly charged forum, about whether he played any role in inflaming tensions at all with some of his rhetoric. Was that off the cuff or was that deliberate? I think a lot of, at the end of the day, if the Commission finds the Emergencies Act was justified, I wonder if they will also talk about it only became justified because up to that point, these protests had been mismanaged so badly by everyone responsible that people felt as if they were left with no other choice. But maybe there are many different things that could have been done, dozens or thousands of decisions that could have been made differently that would have prevented its necessity.
Well, absolutely. We've certainly heard time and again stories of chaos and confusion. So, Chris, what will you be listening for? What will you be watching out for as Justin Trudeau testifies?
So this might sound odd, but I'll be a little bit less attentive to what he's saying. But what I will be looking for, too, is all the documents that we get in the background, particularly possibly text messages and emails he sends, because I have never seen either a text message or an email that the Prime Minister has ever sent. But if history in this commission demonstrates anything, is that we will see text messages. We've seen them from almost everyone else, including his top ministers and his Chief of Staff, Katie Telford, who's testifying tonight. So I really want to see what he's saying in the background during these discussions leading up to the Emergencies Act on February 14th. What's he sending to his staff? What is his staff telling him, and how is he responding to that? What tone does he use? Joanna was talking about how he can be introspective sometimes on stage. I too would love to hear that tomorrow, but maybe we'll get a glimpse of that in the documents behind the scenes. So I'll be actually watching very closely for that, obviously listening as well, but sometimes what we've been getting in the background and that we then can report in our stories is just as interesting or even more interesting than what's being said on the stand.
Absolutely, and of course such an important day given the fact that it will be the Prime Minister testifying, so of course we'll have full coverage here on CPAC. But for tonight, Joanna Smith of the Canadian Press, Chris Nardi from the National Post, really appreciate our time once again. Thank you for tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.
One more day.
One more day.